Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to what is, in a sense, the capstone presentation of today's conference. And we have with us Professor Joseph Fuller from the Harvard Business School. Professor Fuller is going to be talking about managing the future of work, COVID-19, and the shift to a next normal. Professor Fuller is a professor of management practice at the Harvard Business School, the co-director of the school's long-term project, Managing the Future of Work, and co-heads the university-wide project on the workforce. He is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a distinguished fellow at the Strada Institute. Prior to joining Harvard's faculty, Joe was a founder and long-term CEO of Monitor, which is now Monitor Deloitte, the global consultancy. He studies issues related to employment and income polarization and the relationship between talent, corporate strategy, and economic competitiveness. Specifically, he is focused on the skills gap and changing requirements driven by technological innovation. His research spans the many issues that will shape the future of work, many of which we have discussed today, including the emerging gig economy, the impact of care obligations on workforce demographics, the misalignment of the education sector and employers, and how corporate human resource and operating policies inadvertently undermine their economics and frustrate important ambitions. Joe also leads an extensive research project on the evolution of the C-suite in global companies. Good morning, Joe, and welcome to the conference. We are all eager to hear you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ali. It's also a privilege to follow my colleague, Professor Chowdhury, who's doing extraordinarily interesting work. I have the great privilege of joining you today and to try to provide some broad umbrella to wrap up the entire conference, but the disadvantage, of course, of not having been able to join you for it and not knowing what many of my predecessors in this conference had to say. So I'll hope to share some themes with you that are of interest, but I think are broadly relevant, and leave you perhaps with some thoughts about how you and your companies or you and your research can take advantage of some of the things we see as a consequence of COVID-19. One of the first things we see almost universally in COVID is that it has accelerated many trends that were latent, underlying the evolution of work, particularly in the big players in the global trading system, and it's accelerated it very, very rapidly. So some of the trends we're going to be talking about were already latent in the economy, and that's important because the groundwork is laid for rapid changes in the future of work. Let's contrast that to where we stand with the vaccine, where we have to invent new science, test it, and then scale it. Here, as we know from this conference, the technology exists to do things like distance work, as Professor Chowdhury was describing, because we all have PCs with cameras built in, with microphones built in, internet access, wireless and wired, quite good global fiber connectivity. We're not relying on satellites. We're not relying on voice lines alone. Many changes that were not even widely available in the world 10, 12, 15 years ago have made our survival economically, especially for white-collar workers, possible in this downturn. Imagine trying to do what you've been doing in your last 3 or 4 months in your work back in 2005, back in 2008. So let me share some broad themes with you. About how work is evolving.
Joe, would you like to go on to slideshow?
I'm trying to, but for some reason my...
Are you on the Mac?
No, I'm on a Windows machine. It seems to be being a little cranky today, but
okay. Let's go.
My F5 is not wanting to work, so maybe all those technical changes I was just saying have not entirely settled. So I wanted to start by painting a few scenarios of how the future of work is going to unfold. And I do that because it is impossible to forecast for what's going to happen in the next year or two, but it is possible to plan. And to plan in an area of such great uncertainty, we need to frame the possibilities of how work's going to evolve in the next few years. If by looking at each of those scenarios, we can begin to isolate the factors that are common across the scenarios such that we can have a strategy that allows us to exploit the inevitable and to take steps that are going to be legitimate and sound across multiple scenarios without committing to a single scenario, which would be quite risky indeed. So I'm going to talk about 4 different scenarios. One I call digital distancing, a second touchless growth, a third ongoing disruption, and a fourth new paradigms. And let me just highlight each of those very briefly, what the different attributes of the scenario as I'm describing it are, and what the implications of this particular scenario are. And in the digital distancing scenario, I think we're going to see trends that are latent already in the economy, such as the rapid adoption of artificial intelligence automation, widespread and permanent adoption of COVID work practices. What do I mean? Maximize distance work, minimize human-to-human interaction. You're going to see a reluctance of employees and consumers to engage in optional interactions, so that this is going to lead to changes in the nature of demand, maybe permanent reductions in the nature of demand for various business models. And we'll see the acceleration of infrastructure technology deployment, particularly 5G. Why? In the United States, we've seen a terrible inequity in terms of the ability to do distance education based on the accessibility of wireless connectivity. 5G would be a major improvement in that, and hopefully policymakers in the United States, for a change, will show some forward-looking attitudes and take steps to significantly reduce the amount of local barriers to the deployment of 5G. Now, what do all those mean? Because we can all sit around and describe futures, but we're really interested in the corporate implications, the organizational implications of any one of these futures, because we're looking for those common denominator attributes that executives and decision makers have to prepare for in the future through this scenario exercise. Well, the first is we're going to have leaner organizations. I've spoken to over 30 CEOs in the last month. I asked them all the same questions. This is not organized research, but all of them talk about having staff, when they're back to their next normal stage, on the order of 75 to 80%.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I
Yes.
think there's some feedback from the audience. It might help to go into slideshow. You know, there's an icon at the bottom.
Yes, I'm afraid though that
it's working. There we go.
Okay, good. Very good. Thank you to the audience. Already I'm learning from you. CEOs are anticipating fewer headcount than they had historically, on the order of 80% of their historical levels. So we're, in most scenarios, we're going to have leaner organizations. We're going to have a huge demand for digitalization skills, whether that's digital marketers, data analysts, people who are adept at AI and machine learning, Internet of Things. There's going to be an acceleration of the barbellization of the workforce in this scenario. That means a major dislocation for low-skilled workers, because if consumers and employees are reluctant to engage in old, high-touch business models, those service industries that are mass employers of lower-skilled workers will be permanently impaired. And finally, it's going to be much harder to manage employee engagement and alignment in this scenario. I have to admit that I'm going to talk to Professor Chowdhury when we're both back at Harvard about this theory of distance work being one that will be equally enjoyable with working on premises. Human beings are inherently social beings. They like to mix with people. We have a lot of data from companies that employees are expressing that they miss work, they miss their colleagues, and that goes beyond their ability to be productive in their work, it literally has to do with having a sense of community. And that's a completely different proposition if you're anywhere from your hometown in India to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Doesn't mean that it's either right or wrong. It merely means that we're going to have different models for people, and one of universal distance work is going to be very hard to sustain. Let me go to my second attribute, touchless growth. How is this different from digital distancing? Well, the first is here we have a pretty good rebound in demand. So it's less dire than digital distancing, where there will be change over time to reduce avoidable human interaction, but we're not going to have the rapid acceleration of things like automation in tasks where the economics of automation really aren't very favorable unless you're putting a huge risk premium on human-human interaction. We will continue to see an acceleration of new patterns of demand and customer expectations about digital service. And we're going to see significant innovation in enabling technologies to allow that, like Internet of Things. What does that mean in terms of the implications? We're going to have a gradual but ultimately significant rebound in employment. The content of jobs at all levels will begin to change because that desire to introduce more touchless technology will increase, but not as quickly as in digital distancing. We're going to see actually more disruption in white collar roles than in lower skill roles. Why is that? We're going to see a significant acceleration in deployment of AI. I'll talk about that a little later. And we'll see a continuation of globalization in this scenario because we will not have the type of disruption we're going to talk about in our next scenario. In this scenario, the most unpleasant of the three, we're going to see regular interruption, like a bad wireless signal of demand because of public health concerns and political dislocation. That attenuation of the crisis leads to an accelerating cycle of business failure. Then you get political responses that could either take the form of dramatic steps that ultimately inhibit labor market flexibility. What do I mean by that? Some of the things we might see if there's a Democratic sweep in the United States, where you'd have a dramatic increase in the national minimum wage, rapid reintroduction of rules that favor private sector unionization. I'm not speaking for or against these. I'm just saying that steps like that in the United States would Europeanize the labor market in the United States. And one of the major drivers of structurally low economic growth in the EU is the lack of labor market flexibility. No one adds a job in Holland or in Spain or in Italy in a global company if they can possibly avoid it, because essentially you've formed an economic lifetime contract with that person. You add the jobs in Singapore, in historically Hong Kong, in the United States, in India. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, we end up with a localization of talent pools, and perhaps quite a lot of what Professor Chowdhury was talking about in terms of more distance work, because the work will have to be sent to where it can be done, and where there are clusters of talent, perhaps in a world full of barriers, there would actually be more distance work. Companies will be extremely cautious about adding new workers, growing their workforce in terms of how they go about cultivating workers, which means they'll probably invest more in reskilling or upskilling their existing workforce rather than add workers. I think this also suggests that employers will adopt some more flexible work practices. Now, of course, that contrasts with my fear that political responses will end up inhibiting widespread employment. But what it means is, because digital skills will be at a premium and local markets will be isolated, labor markets will be isolated, companies will have to work hard to take steps that will attract and keep the workers they need. They'll have to accommodate the individual ambitions of workers rather than say, here are the rules we work by, you must do it this way, you must do it that way, and have that worker choose to go elsewhere. My final scenario, new paradigms, a little bit more creative, that we're going to see continuation of innovation work practices. We're going to have more and more credentials that are be be created, rather than just relying on your university degree or perhaps your certification in your industry. I'm a certified public accountant, I'm an engineer. We're going to see micro credentials, as we see in some of the tech sector today. We're going to see a significant proliferation of working relationships. What do I mean by that? More gig workers, more seasonal workers, not seasonal workers in terms of picking crops or planting crops, but rather seasonal workers, perhaps like older workers who want to spend 2 or 3 months in the mountains or at a lake house or overseas visiting children, but still have valuable skills, and the company will accommodate that. The company will accommodate more job sharing, more distance work, because the need for digital skills will be such that workers will have a choice as to whom they work for, and they'll gravitate to employers who provide that type of flexibility. I think in this type of enterprise, in this type of scenario, we'll also see more work across company lines or across institutional lines like universities with companies. New types of working relationships emerge. That requires new types of workforce planning, because I'm not planning for a world which is I hire somebody or I hire a supplier to do the work, but there are multiple different ways I engage people to do the work I need done. That means different types of working relationships, far more complexity for functions like HR, and more migration over the course of your career. You go from a paid internship to on-site full-time work, to off-site full-time work, perhaps to seasonal work or gig work over time. That changes all work processes. Imagine relying on gig workers for your most sensitive work. How are you going to do IP protection? How are you going to do performance review? How are you going to manage the relationship between a gig worker who may be making much more per day and your full-time worker who has the guarantee of ongoing employment, but is troubled by the fact that someone who might be their peer in terms of the work they're doing on a process is making more than they are? Not a very comfortable managerial situation, which means we're going to have new types of managerial talent. Now, why did I do all this? I didn't do this to try to convince you one of these is right. I did this so that we could talk about what are the common attributes across this range of scenarios that provide a rough picture frame of what we might see in the future. And I've isolated 7. I'd be interested in some of you have more things you want to ask or want to suggest as to common attributes. So here are the 7 that I think are most important. I'm going to go clockwise, starting at the top. We're going to see a greater investment in touchless operations. That's everything from AI to automation of workplace where it is affordable. Companies are going to evaluate the employing human beings do things as having an added measure of risk, a risk of illness, a risk of infection to other workers, a risk of regulation. And therefore, when in doubt, they're going to migrate to alternatives. Effectively, what's happened is the ROI calculation for deploying technology is going to change. The second thing is we're going to manage a workforce with changed attitudes. Could be an attitude about whether I want to go to a place of business because I'm worried about perhaps being exposed, not necessarily just to COVID-19, but whatever comes next. It may be that people who have experienced work from home now understand that they like it and it's beneficial to them. They're able to have less time commuting, let's say. We all know the commutes in major Indian cities, as in major American cities, can be miserable experiences. What if I can work from home or work in a satellite office, be more involved with my family, as Professor Chowdhury was talking about? We're going to see permanent changes in patterns of demand, things like home delivery of products and services. We're going to see disrupted supply chains. This is something the big global companies are just beginning to wrestle with. Their supply chain is as vulnerable to the weakest link in it insofar as what the public health situation there is. So if you are a company that relies heavily on inputs from Brazil right now, even if you're a European company and your in-region supply chain is beginning to rebound, you are at risk. We're going to see increases in government intervention. I think that's whether it's in public health areas, work practice areas, social insurance. We're going to see reconfigured work processes. And we're going to see a phenomenon that I call staff to the trough. What do I mean by that? Historically, companies have essentially staffed to their budget. So they anticipate their staffing needs based on what they think they're going to do in terms of business activity. But one of the ironies of that is if you take all the competitors in a sector, if you take an Infosys's budget, a Tata Consultancy's budget, a Wipro's budget, and add them all up, all their revenue forecast added together vastly exceed what's actually going to happen on the demand side. So depend on competitiveness and whatnot, companies gain or lose share and therefore need that staff or don't. But the paradigm has been staff to the budget. Don't miss an opportunity to do the work yourself. I think increasingly companies are going to staff to the trough in their forecast and use other mechanisms to fill the demand for work if they under forecast what they actually achieve. Say a little bit more about that later. So if we're looking for these common denominators, let me just isolate several of them just to talk about quickly. And I want to talk about attitudes about work. This is a survey of global studies, global companies, where they asked employees before returning to work, I want my company to ensure that. And I've highlighted these in two different colors. And the blue has to do with the implementation of essentially public health protocols. But notice in the yellow, a different category of stipulations that employees want to place on their companies. They have to do with work practices. I want to have more flexible sick leave policy. So if I'm sick or perhaps my relative is sick, the company won't penalize me for not working. I want me to skip work if I feel unsafe. Those are very important words. I want to continue to working from home if I don't feel safe going to the office, even if the office is opened. I don't want to be required to travel for work. I want to work remotely at any point that I stipulate. This is why I isolated that variable as a common one. The variable is saying new attitudes about work by employees. If you think about what is implied in this chart, it's a change in the contract, the psychological contract between employer and employee. What does that suggest? Employers are going to have to prepare for a workforce where there are workers who can't go back to work or won't. What do I mean by can't go back to work? Maybe they have comorbidities. They have a respiratory problem, or they have a compromised immune system. But there'll also be those who can no longer arrange for childcare. In some research I've done, I've estimated that about a third of the childcare seats in the United States are going to go away by the as a function of COVID-19. There are going to be those with anxieties who are simply worried about going back to work. The rise of behavioral health problems in the pandemic have been very significant. I think there are going to be workers who are near retirement age that simply choose not to come back. They're older, they're more vulnerable, perhaps their pension benefit or other benefits were not going to increase if they work the final 1 or 2 or 3 years of their employment contract. And there'll be workers who are inhibited by transportation. Certainly anybody who commutes in a city like Mumbai, whether they'd want to get on one of those packed commuter trains, open to question. And if they're scared because perhaps they had got comorbidities or they're just anxious about the state of the pandemic going forward, they will just choose not to come back to work if they cannot work remotely. Let me pick a second one. This is a survey done by Deloitte and Fortune magazine about the change in terms of investment patterns by large companies. We're going to see a massive increase in digitalization of companies, moving to those touchless processes. I think you're going to see it first in areas like global supply chain, but eventually you're going to see it in areas like marketing. Now, this is going to exacerbate one of those trends I talked about earlier, and it's going to have very profound implications for where work is done. And I think perhaps with some great opportunities for Indian companies, because if you look at American executives, they are deeply worried that the US suffers from a digital skills gap, that even their well-paid workers now do not have the types of digital skills that are going to be required in this environment of accelerating digitalization. And I just would like to point out that a lot of this has been revealed to US executives by the way work has been done under COVID. What they've seen is a lot of their higher paid white collar workers don't actually know how the data works, don't actually know how to access it. They preside over processes supervising people who have that knowledge. And that's going to lead to some thinking about the structure of hierarchies in companies. Do I really need to have process owners like that who are expensive? By the way, US executives are right to be anxious about this, because right now almost 2/3 of the American workforce struggle to use the computing resources they already have available to them at work. Now, I visited India about 18 months ago to make a talk about the future of work, and some of the research I looked at also suggested that there were skills gaps in India itself. But the type of resources that are available in the Indian IT sector are likely to be much more in demand than they have been in the migration to on-site waterfall type software design and project management is going to be at least diverted and perhaps slowed down, if not, agile. The move to agile software development and project management is likely to be slowed down or somewhat inhibited by COVID. Perhaps a greater reliance on the type of traditional waterfall development that Indian companies have relied on will be a consequence of that. Another consequence of all this is going to be the growth of gig work or contingent work. And on this, I am not, I'm sorry, let me just point out one other thing. There'll also be a great increase in the adoption of artificial intelligence, because there's been a massive increase in the speculative development of innovative companies there. As you can see that in just the last few years, much more money has been spent on AI development than the previous decade. I also wanted to talk about gig workers. Gig workers have been growing in the United States, certainly, very consistently over recent years. And the fastest growing category of gig workers is people who make more than 100,000 US through gig work. So this is not the growth of Uber, it's not the growth of food delivery services. This is the growth of higher paid workers. And some research I'll publish in the late fall, you can see this penetration of the use of what I call alternative labor relationships across different functions in large companies. So moving from right to left, significant use on the right, all the way to not using gig workers on the left. You can see it's not just an IT phenomenon. It's happening in operations. It's happening in more than half of companies in marketing, almost half of companies in R&D and HR. This trend is going to accelerate. Why is it going to accelerate? The first reason it's going to accelerate is people who are digital natives, mobile natives, understand how to use cutting edge technology and good learning at it are going to be at an exceptional premium, because there's going to be this nonlinear acceleration of investment in technology, in particularly digital technologies. And the people who can operate in those environments and do it effectively are going to be in such demand that many companies are not going to be able to attract the talent they want in the form of a full-time worker that's willing to accept the pay pack and benefits on offer. Imagine being a durable goods manufacturer in the Midwest seeking an expert in AI-enabled global supply chains, and they're competing with Apple for that person. They're competing with Caterpillar for that person. They're competing with Unilever for that person, and they're $1 billion manufacturing company. They simply won't be able to get world-class talent, but they're going to be unable to rely on the skills of the person who's willing to accept the job, because they're not going to be state-of-the-art. Where are they going to turn? They're going to turn to people who've got the state-of-the-art skills, who are more expensive per day and per hour than what they can afford, but they will find ways to access the quality of talent they need by relying on gig platforms. I think this is going to be a significant element in that ability to staff to the trough rather than the peak. And once again, this could be of great help to India, where there are significant opportunities to grow the productivity of the Indian economy through the use of gig platforms. So I've already touched on a few of these things, but what I really wanted to convey to you is that there are going to be structural changes irrespective of the scenarios that whichever scenario emerges. And it won't be one of mine full bore. It's going to be some different scenario that who can possibly know. But it suggests that companies are going to have to pick some common denominator responses and plan for those. And that's the point of doing a scenario exercise. I think one common denominator phenomena I want to underscore here is your most skilled employees in the future are going to be volunteers. What do I mean by that? I mean that they are going to have a choice as to where they work. And just like any volunteer for a charity or volunteer for let's say military service, they pick whether or not they want to go. And employers who are able to create an environment with a work-life balance that recognizes the uniqueness of that important individual and what they want out of work are going to win. And those that continue to have, here's our formal job description, this is the way we do it, any exception takes massive consideration and usually is turned down, that's simply not going to attract the talent you need. And that's certainly going to be the case in countries, jurisdictions like the EU particularly, but I think also the US, which are going to have a severe supply-demand imbalance with the right type of worker, the worker that is a digital native and is able to blend the soft skills, the so-called social skills, with digital competency to be a highly productive worker in the future. One last thing I want to just highlight for you, because I'm in conversations with multiple governments recently, and because I've challenged them to talk about this question of how do you avoid taking well-meaning steps at this stage of the pandemic and in the aftermath to try to protect workers, which end up making structural isolation from the workforce more severe. And I've brought forward a number of different government actions that I believe will be commonly important across different jurisdictions. One is that we're going to have to revamp the way employers and educators collaborate. Too much of education is too distant from the realities of the workplace, overweighted toward traditional forms of study with a calendar and a set of pedagogical methods that do not really mesh very well with the demands of the workplace. I want to make absolutely clear, though, that this is not a call for huge new investments in STEM at the expense of liberal arts and traditional humanities. All the data in the United States knowledge, broader intellect, broader sense of broader range of intellectual and personal experiences that excel over time, exactly the type of education the Ashoka is configured to deliver. A second one is that governments are going to have to provide an explicit set of incentives to reskill or upskill existing workers, because the pace of change in technology is going to be such that workers cannot possibly keep up. And in multiple economies, certainly China, United States, those with less labor protection, it's a lot of disruption and a lot of expense for governments in the form of things like social benefits. Much better for governments to try to help companies take the workforce they've got and turn it into the workforce they need. How can that be done? All sorts of tax schemes, tax credits, encouraging inter-company programs to teach skills. Yes, whenever you do that, there's always a risk of some bad actors taking advantage of a program, but we can't through the lens of what it does to employment. We do this for say, how's this going to affect job creation? How's this going to affect the level of employment? That's going to become particularly important as it affects lower skilled workers, because lower skilled workers on the outside looking in, they don't have access to distance capability. They don't have the type of digital skills that are going to be most in demand. Even if it's the digital skill of repairing higher levels of automation in a factory workplace or in a consumer services workplace. So if we don't think about legislation through this lens, the magnitude of the dislocation of those most vulnerable workers will even be greater. Economics are going to inflict a big enough penalty on this class of worker. We can't let legislation inflict even more. And finally, we need to invest in better information flows about what jobs are available, what credentials are required. So let me pause there. I know that for many of you, a lot of these themes are ones that have been touched on early parts of the conference, but let me come back to Ali and see if there's some questions that I can answer from the audience.
Thank you, Joe. That was quite a sweeping summary of what's going on. Actually, before we go to the audience questions, I have a question for you. Because you've actually spent time in the consulting sector for a very long time. Do you think this is the most disruptive change which has happened since the time that you were first in consulting?
To the consulting sector specifically?
No, in terms of the impact on human on the human
more broadly,
race.
yeah. I would say that it's the biggest shock. I think the shock is going to actually unleash the biggest change, which is we're going to see a fundamental rethink of the way companies process information and the way decision rights in companies are allocated. And that is the heart of management. I think that it's going to be a bad time in the next 10 years to be a white collar executive who's reasonably expensive, has narrow and deep expertise that essentially relies on a heuristic derived from my experience in doing this. So a very adept manager can basically think through the implications of a 15 by 30 matrix. And that ability is honed often through 10, 15 years of rich experience. So they know the summer was hot, or the monsoon was late, or there was this type of electoral result. Here are some of the implications. Imagine, an AI system can, in nanoseconds, process a 10,000 by 60,000 matrix. So if you're a retail merchandising executive who picks the assortment for next year, and you rely on what was on the cover of fashion magazines and who wore what to the Oscars, AI will dominate that, and as will Internet of Things. So every development which is going to be accelerated will call for a more skilled workforce and one that has more capacity to learn as the velocity changes. And that's going to have profound implications for all sorts of institutions. And as you know, as the consulting industry is very, very resilient. It figures out ways to try to add value in light of change. But change is generally the industry of it helps the consulting industry.
There's a question on whether this is like a reset for the world. Are these changes irreversible?
I think some of them are, yes. And I'm going to draw here on what we've learned in previous economic disruptions. If you look at the 08-09 downturn, which is quite different, that was a classic financial panic where certain institutions had financial instabilities that created both anxiety about the soundness of other financial institutions, that caused the sounder financial institutions to start to take steps that actually exacerbated the panic, and then we had a demand collapse. Now we have a simultaneous demand supply collapse. That's unprecedented. But even in 08-09, the dot-com temporary meltdown in 01, the oil shock, going back, most of your audience is too young to have lived through that. What happens is institutions learn. And I think what institutions are learning Professor Chowdhury was saying is they've learned that there's quite a lot of work they can do remotely. They've learned that customers will adapt their behavior if given sufficient incentive. Historically, the logic of an Amazon was that was a price or service incentive. But now Amazon is and the Netflixes of the world have enjoyed very rapid growth. Their highest growth is with older consumers who were reluctant adopters, but now they've learned.
Yeah.
So I think that learning means that these types of changes are going to be permanent. And a big one, I think, perhaps the single most disruptive with lots of effects on individuals' lives is going to be a significant permanent contraction of business travel, because that affects all the economics of the travel industry.
Yeah. There's a people management type of question. What are the additional soft skills that both managers and team members will have to acquire, given that work from home is going to be such a big part of what happens now?
Well, I thought you asked Professor Chowdhury a great question, Ali, about productivity management. People are going to have to think about productivity differently. They're going to have to think about the basis of evaluation differently. We know from all sorts of controlled experiments that evaluative processes and hiring processes can be quite arbitrary, not in a sinister way where people are trying to do nasty things, but just as you want to see your physician for them, your radiologist first thing in the morning because their error rate is lower, you want your job interview to be early in the morning. You want it to be in the middle of the week, not the beginning of the week. It's helpful if you have shared social interest with your supervisor. A lot of those things will be mooted out. And they're going to have to be new bases of evaluation. They're going to have to be new managerial skills and motivation. How do I understand how my workers are feeling? The productivity of the impacts of this are quite uneven. I've been talking to a couple of the very famous US tech companies. Their engineering talent is 30 to 40% more productive right now than pre-COVID, more productive. Why? They don't have a 90-minute commute both ways to get to the office in San Francisco or in San Jose. The sense of when the workday ends is suspended, especially for those that don't have families. So they find themselves working at 9 at night because they say, oh, I'll just finish this coding. I'll just finish this project. So how do you create a work environment for those people that is balanced? They also see increased inquiries about voluntary leaves of absences because they're seeing people are getting worn out. So the number one word I do want to share in this overlong answer, Ali, I think that managers are going to have to be more empathetic. They're going to have to think about each individual on their team, not by job description, but by their life circumstance. Someone who has, for example, a child with asthma is going to have to be treated differently than someone who's caring for their parents, or a single young worker that is more likely to remain a volunteer. I hope people will keep that idea in mind. Continue to volunteer to stay at my company if they can live in Bali, or if they can live in the Amalfi Coast or some other glorious site.
A very deep question: is organizational loyalty a thing of the past?
Are organized what?
Organizational loyalty, is it a thing of the past?
No. I don't think so at all. I think it's going to go up.
Okay.
I think that companies that can be empathetic at an institutional level, and they will address that problem. And it wasn't. I think organizational loyalty historically is overrated. I think that a lot of people mistook the terrible information available about where skill was and was it accessible, and the caution that people had about changing positions, and confused it with organizational loyalty. I think LinkedIn exposed that loyalty was much less deep than people hoped it was.
Yeah, I think, Joe, where that came from was that when we were talking about the session when we were briefing you, you did mention that the gig economy will increase, and you could actually have people working for more than one organization at a time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
To that extent, loyalty or ties to one organization may go down,
Yeah.
at least in that.
I think that there'll be more people. I think, in fact, the growth of high-skilled gig work reflects the inability of a lot of companies to create a working package that is attractive to the person with that skills. So if they do want to live by a lake or live in the mountains or go to the mountains for the summer, they don't want to bicker with their supervisor about that. And also they find that they can make more, or make the same amount for working less, and then they can write the novel or paint pictures or spend more time with their children or their families. So I think the question of loyalty, too many companies have denominated loyalty in the frame of the employee should continue to work for me and owes me an obligation of telling me when they're thinking about leaving.
Yeah.
That's no more loyal than a marriage that's based on one person being monogamous and one person isn't.
That's a great comparison, Joe. There is a question on what is the financial impact on service companies? Companies which provide services to consumers. What's the long-term financial impact likely to be?
Well, it certainly depends on the nature of the service, but things that have high-touch personal services are going to be vulnerable in a couple of ways. There's going to be a significant segment of consumers that do not ever go back to using the service, or don't come back in a time period that is going to help with the economics of the enterprise. The second is, when you create a form of demand, particularly in countries like India and the United States, you get innovation. So if you suddenly say, the ability of my I'm in the physical therapy business, and the ability my consumers are worried about coming to get physical therapy, or many people who need physical therapy have some other comorbidity and they don't want to go out. That creates all sorts of people who are saying, isn't it interesting that people who need help after a stroke learning how to walk better and regain their balance and equilibrium can't get to physical therapy? What can we do in VR to help them get that back? And all of a sudden, boom, major change in demand. So it's very asymmetric to industry, but it's going to be arguably in the long term a great boon, because you will get more innovation, and that will create better economics and increase people's spending power.
In a sense, the question on service organizations, Joe, leads to a segue into universities. How would Harvard, and for that matter, Ashoka, be affected by the fact that you're doing remote education rather than having people on campus?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to, of course, emphasize I'm in no way speaking for Harvard institutionally, but my sense is several-fold. First of all, this is going to once again lead to innovation. So if you look at edX, the consortium that Harvard and MIT founded for distance learning, their enrollment in programs went up by a factor of 30x from February, March, April 2019 to February, March, April 2020. 30 times the demand. They were historically enrolling about 30,000 people in new programs. They got to 1 million a month.
Right.
That shows the capacity of that. It also, so it'll spur further innovation. By the way, the enrollment was across all topics. It wasn't just, I want to take computer science or I want to take cyber. So liberal arts, humanities, everything. I think it's extremely, the one of the things that is wonderful about the academy is that you could take what they would call in the UK a Don, a professor at Oxford from the 14th century, and basically explain to them the structure of Harvard University, and they would understand it. So this has not been a hugely dynamic in terms of structural forms, but it's going to be extremely difficult given our pedagogical models to have the type of, particularly at elite universities, to have the type of impact we've aspired to have on students without having a great amount of proximity. So I think the next several years will be telling, and that we'll see innovative models of instruction which are hybrid in nature, blended on-site and remote, and are probably more interinstitutional, so more institutions will share resources rather than having a poor execution of this and execution of that. One final thought is certainly in the United States, there's going to be widespread financial distress in the sector, and you'll see multiple institutions close.
Yeah, there's a question on, is there any study, although it's a little early, where a client's expectations have been captured in the sense that their partners are working with what could be perceived as unsupervised workforces? Are clients okay with that? Are they demanding a greater degree of supervision or a way of measuring productivity?
Yeah, it's too early. And in fact, one of the things that companies are finding is that their traditional metrics don't work. So I think that's going to be in their own way an area of innovation. Let me just give you an illustration. We already had for more advanced companies in markets like the United States, we already had an initial screening of candidates being done by AI systems remotely. So I think when we get to things like productivity measure, even maybe measures of teamwork, so there's going to be innovation how we measure that. There's going to be experimentation of that. At my university level project at Harvard, we are putting out proposals right now for what we call a skills lab, which would be really to try to study from a deep research perspective, how do people acquire skills? Not do they have them, but particularly those soft social skills.
Yeah.
Can they be learned? Where do they pick them up? Can you create a curriculum around them? How do you study them? How do you also make them transferable? Because for many workers, what happens is they deliver it in a familiar environment, but then they get promoted or they go to another workplace, and all of a sudden their skills fall off because they're not as comfortable. They don't know all the implicit rules.
Joe, one of the big concerns at this point is that there is a silent pandemic of mental health,
Yes.
which is taking place. So, is there a sense of the effects of continuous screen time and isolation?
Yes. I think that's very profound. We see significant increases in rates of anxiety and depression. We also saw more behavioral health issues emerging before the pandemic demographically. So particularly among university graduates, more recent graduates have higher instances of behavioral health issues than their older siblings and certainly their parents. There are many hypotheses about that, the impact of things like social media and whatnot. But this is going to be this is a very troubling. I'm actually doing a podcast episode for people. I'm recording it Monday, so we should have it up in about 2 or 3 weeks on our podcast, Managing the Future of Work. But this is going to be something that companies are going to have to take greater ownership over and have much more empathy for, to use a word I used earlier, that the old ways of motivating and controlling people, whether it be promotion or compensation or peer pressure, some of those are going to be fractured. And particularly for these higher skilled workers, what it's going to take to get them to volunteer as opposed to go to that next employer or become a gig worker is going to require some understanding of who they are and maybe what kind of support they need.
Yeah. Joe, my last two questions. One is, again, it might be early to say, but is there an organization or organizations which is handling this scenario well in terms of adjusting their business quickly?
Well, I think several. I mean, obviously, the scale retailers, the Amazons and the Walmarts, have done a quite good job. And I think a lot of the distribution companies, certainly in the US, have done a good job, since their patterns of demand, all their assets are configured around ratable changes in growth. And all of a sudden, a good example is that the capacity for toilet tissue in the United States is, it's not designed to grow and change product assortment rapidly, but just despite all the vaguely amusing headlines about it, no one ultimately ran out. I think that actually hospitals did quite a remarkable job in the United States, with very grave economic effects for them, by the way, because as they eliminated all the profitable parts of being a hospital and just focused on unprofitable parts of being a hospital. So I think that's been quite good. There have been companies that create certain parts of what's been in short supply. For example, respirators, masks, that have done a remarkable job increasing capacity. But the vast majority of companies have they've survived and they've maintained some continuity service, largely because of tech investments they made in the last decade, but they can't sustain it indefinitely. So it's becoming apparent where the business models just cannot absorb this type of disruption going forward.
So the last question, Joe, and I think I speak for everyone when I ask this, is the traditional career growth path thing of the past?
In the way I interpret you mean that, Ali, I think largely yes. I think that the kind of cursus honorum that people followed, they were a graduate, they perhaps got a graduate degree, then they joined a top firm and they hope to get advanced at a certain cadence and then hope for better paying, higher paying job, and then maybe begin thinking about heading off to another company for a further advancement. That'll still exist, but I think one of the things most companies are going to have to be worried about is that there are turnover is going to be highest among your best performers, because they're going to have the most options, whether it's gig or companies desperate for what they can do, and you need to keep those all-arounders if you're gonna win the test match.
Thank you very much, Joe. One last question from someone in the audience: is that background behind you real?
No, I wish it were. That is a very nice fall picture of our campus at the Harvard Business School, and I wanted to remember what it looked like. I've only been there once since March, so I wish it were.
Thank you, Joe. That was just
My
a
pleasure.
wonderful, spectacular session. I think the audience is very happy with most of your answers. A panoramic view of what's going on right now. On behalf of Ashoka and the audience, thank you very much, Joe, for being
My
here.
pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you.